Today we will be continuing on with our dress shirt. So we're going to be doing our shoulders and side seams, and then we're going to be preparing our collar to get put onto our shirt. So let's go ahead and switch over and we'll get started. Okay, so here I've got my front where we've got our popover placket completed, and then this is my back with the fisheye darts completed on there. So we're going to put these two right sides together, and we're going to stitch up our shoulders and our side seam. The seams that we're doing on this shirt are going to be welt seams, just like we did on our child's dress last semester. And the reason for that is that welt seams are one of the most common seams that you see on men's and boys' dress wear. So we want to stick to that category. Okay, so for the shoulders, I'm just matching up the corners first, and then coming and putting a pin in between. And then for my side seam, again, I'm going to match up those corners first. And then you do have one notch that's right about the chest line. So at the widest part of the chest. So I'm going to go ahead and put a pin in that spot too. And then we'll just work our way in between, matching up the raw edges. Okay, I'll do the same for my other side seam. Okay, let's go stitch all 4 of those at 1/2 inch. Okay, so I'm starting down at the hemline corner of one of my side seams. I'm going to work my way up to the shoulder, or sorry, the underarm. You're welcome to do either. You can go from the underarm down or the side seam up. Make sure your edges stay even. So mine were separating a little bit right here. Just fixing that before I continue. Okay, shoulder seam next. Other shoulder seam. Now my other side seam. Okay, let's head back to our ironing board. Okay, so for all 4 of those, the first thing I'm going to do is trim off any threads that I have still hanging off. Got some here, but I guess I didn't trim last time. Okay, now we're going to bust all of those open. So I'm going to start with one of my side seams. If you have a roll, so this is a pressing roll, it's basically just like a ham, except it's long and skinny. You can do it that way. If not, you can just try and lay it flat on the table where the underneath layer doesn't have a lot of wrinkles. So this helps prevent from getting wrinkles down on the bottom. Okay, so this side seam, if you look at it from the edge, it goes in a little bit, curves in a little bit towards the waist area. So we're just going to do one single snip right in the middle where it curves in. And that's just to release that tension where it curves in. Okay, and then again, we're going to do these as welt seams. So the first thing we're going to do is bust it open. And then we're going to press both of these towards the back of the garment. Okay, and then I can see my fisheye dart is right here, so I know that's the back. So I'm going to go ahead and press it over to that side. Okay. Do the same for my other side seam. Do that single snip right in the middle. And then bust it open. And then I can see my fisheye dart right here, so I know that's the back. I'm going to press both of them over that direction. Shoulders. Okay, now we're going to flip this right side out because we want to do the top stitching for the welt seam. So the welt seam, if you remember, you press both towards the back and then you do that 1/4 inch top stitching to hold them down. We want to do that top stitching from the outside so that it looks as even and clean as possible. So I'm going to flip this right side out. And then I'm going to stick in a few pins just to hold those seam allowances over to the side that I pressed them. Okay. And now we're going to go from the outside. We'll use that original seam line as our guide, and we'll go over towards the back 1/4 inch and stitch those seam allowances down. As a reminder, please make sure you've got cameras turned on and that you are on camera so I can see you're present during class. Okay, so I'm going to start on one of my side seams. Again, I'm using that original seam line as my guide, so I'm going to line that up with the 1/4 inch marking on my foot. My seam allowances are over here where my needle's at, so I'm going to stitch those down at that 1/4 inch. I'm working my way from the hem up on this particular seam, but you can do either from hem up or from the armhole down. You just want to make sure that this is laying completely flat as you're stitching it. So you don't want your fabric to start to come over, so you end up with this bubble. You want to make sure it's really nice and flat as you're stitching. Oh, sorry. Okay, now I'm going to move on to one of my shoulder seams. Stuck on that hump. Okay, other shoulder seam. Okay, and then my final side seam. Trying to make sure I check underneath that nothing's getting stuck under there that isn't supposed to. So make sure you do the same as you go. Okay, let's head back to our ironing board. Okay, so again, I'm going to trim off any threads that I have hanging. Okay, I like to give these one last good press. So each of those seams, go back and just press again so they look really nice and professional and flat. And then we're going to set this aside for the moment so that we can work on our collar. So go ahead and grab your two collar pieces. You should have your top collar, which is the one with interfacing on it. And it has that single notch down at the bottom neckline. And then you have your under collar with no interfacing, and it has that double notch. We're going to go ahead and put these two right sides together and start pinning them. We'll do it just the same as we did in our notebook. The only difference is that we have this little curved extension. So on the ends, we'll pin short ends first. That extension should match up perfectly. So I'm going to go ahead and pin that little area. And then when you get up to the corner, remember those corners are 1/8 of an inch difference. That under collar is slightly smaller. So I'm going to get those corners to match up, pull that shorter one up to the longer one to make sure that it matches. And then you'll have a little bit of difference in length on the side. So you'll need to ease that in. Let's do the same on my other end. Get my corners to match up. And then ease in that little bit of extra fullness on this straight edge here. Okay, then when we come to do the long straight edge at the top, the under collar will be slightly smaller than the top collar. So make sure that you get to the center of both of them. I like to kind of tug on my corners to flatten it out so that that under collar stretches a little bit and meets the length of the top collar. Okay, and I'm going to get right to the center and put a pin there so that I'm splitting the fullness between those two sections. And then I'll go ahead and just pin those two sections. It's only 1/8 of an inch that you are spreading, that you're easing in throughout this whole long seam. So should be a very small amount that you're having to ease in. And just using the stretch of the fabric, you should be able to do it. Okay. Let's go ahead. We're going to go over to our machine and we're going to stitch those edges at 1/4 inch. This bottom edge with the notches on it, that's our neckline. We're going to leave that open until we're ready to put it on the shirt. So let's go stitch these 3 at 1/4. Okay, so now I'm going to start at that bottom neckline corner where the little curved extension is. Line it up with my 1/4 inch on my foot. And if you need to go down in stitch length for this part, where you can go from a 2.5 down to maybe a 2 or a 1.5, you can, and that will just give you a little bit more control on how big of a stitch and how far your needle's going each time you take a stitch. So I'm going to work my way around that curve, and then when I get to this corner, I can leave my needle down so I can pivot. And again, I'm just using the stretch of the fabric to ease in that extra fullness. You might be able to see right here where I've got that little bubble at the bottom. I'm going to tug on this corner to stretch out that top one so that it meets the length of the bottom one. When you get to the corner of your collar, don't forget to reinforce it with that back stitch. So I'm going to do a back stitch on either side. Okay, again, I'm going to reinforce my corner with that back stitch. Okay, let's take this over to our ironing board. I'm going to trim off my thread tails, and then we're going to be ready to start clipping and trimming our seam allowances. So the seam allowance on the under collar side, again, that's the one with no interfacing. This is my top collar, under collar here. I'm going to trim this seam allowance in half the whole way. Okay, now I need to clip. So we've got this extra corner here from where our extension comes out. We need to clip diagonally into that corner, and we're going to get really close to our stitches, but not cut the actual stitches. So here's my little clipped corner. Just did a diagonal clip into there. And then for the curve, we need to take out extra fullness. So we're going to notch out triangles. And we're taking away triangles on that one. I'm going to do miter on my corner here. So cut diagonally across that corner and then take those deeper cuts on either side. Or I guess it's more of a, not a deep cut, but a steeper angle on either side to reduce that bulk at that corner as much as possible. For this other side, I'm going to zoom in so y'all can see a little bit closer. Okay, so again, here at this corner, I need to cut diagonally to my stitches. And then for the curve, I need to take out extra fullness. So we're going to clip away those triangles. Okay, and then miter my corner. So go diagonally across and then take that steeper cut on either side to eliminate as much as possible. Okay, let's zoom back out. Now we need to turn this right side out. Let me clean up my space a little bit. Let's turn this right side out. We're going to start forming those corners. So take your point turner. You're going to start forming the corner of your collar. Okay, so continue to form your corners with your point turner. And I like to do it with my fingers and my nails where I kind of rub it in between and it helps push that corner out even more. Okay, and then I'm going to push out that little curve extension. And make sure that that seam is all the way out as well. I'm going to go ahead and press this little short edge. I'm not really worried about the long edge right now, but get that seam all the way out. Press it from the front collar side. So the one with interfacing is sitting on top. So that way, you know, you're looking at the front of the collar. And as you press, you can make sure that none of the under collar is visible. If you clipped enough into that corner, your corner right here should be laying nice and flat. But if it has little tucks or pulls in it, you may need to go back in and clip a little bit further into that corner. Okay, let's do the same thing on the other side. And then again, from the front, I want that seam right on the edge, but I don't want any of that under collar poking out. I don't want it visible from the outside of the collar at all. Now for that long seam that goes down the top of your collar, we're going to open up our collar and we're going to press both of those seam allowances towards the under collar. So again, that's the one without interfacing. Make sure those are fully separated before you start to press. Okay. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take this over to our machine and we're going to understitch those seam allowances down to the under collar. Before you do that, double check from the outside, look at the front of that seam and make sure that that seam is as flat as possible, that your pieces are fully separated and that you don't have like a little pleat where one of them is starting to kind of roll over to the other side. So always check that. And you can press it from both sides. So now we're going to take it over to our machine and understitch those down. Okay, so I'm going to get back into that corner as far as I can. So kind of pull back that collar. I'm using my old stitch line, which is right here, as my guide. And I'm going to get as close to that as possible. Okay, and again, I'm pulling back this part of the collar so I can get as far into that point as I can. Okay, let's take this back to our ironing board again. Okay, trim up any threads that you have hanging off. And then we're going to press that top edge. Again, from the front collar side, I want that seam right on the edge, but I do not want the under collar visible from the front. Okay, now the last step we're going to do is we're going to do a top stitch along the outside edge of this collar. And what that does is it, number one, just makes it look really nice and neat, but it also helps keep this collar pressed the way that we just pressed it, and it keeps the shape. It holds the shape a little bit better. So along this outside edge where we just stitched, we're going to do a top stitch at 1/4 inch, just like this through all the layers. One thing that we need to remember is that we still need this opening down here to attach it to the neckline of our garment. So when we do this top stitch and we're starting here, we're going to start 1/4 inch away from that neckline, and then we'll do our top stitch the rest of the way. That way, that 1/4 inch seam allowance that's down here is still free to separate. So let's go get that done. Okay, so starting at that bottom corner, I'm going to skip that first 1/4 inch and start a little ways in. And then it's 1/4 inch wide. So the edge of my collar should be in line with that 1/4 inch marking on my foot. Okay, and then again, we're stopping early and we're leaving that last 1/4 inch empty. So you can see, you may be able to see here, it's a little bit hard with that black on black. You can see where my stitch ended right there, and I've got this empty space so that my seam allowances, when I go to attach this to my shirt, my seam allowances can still separate in that portion. Okay, so let's just go clean this up, and that'll be the last step for today. Okay, so just clean this up by taking off any threads that are hanging off, and then you can give it one final press to make sure that it's nice and flat. And that everything is ready to go on your shirt. And we'll start putting this on our shirt next class.